Robert had always believed that nature held no malice. That was before he ventured into Black Hollow Ridge, a mountain notorious for its uncharted trails and vanishing hikers. The locals in the nearby village had warned him against the trek, their eyes shadowed with something between fear and reverence. He dismissed their superstitions as nothing more than folklore meant to spook outsiders. He was wrong. The ascent was grueling, but he had trained for it. The first 2 days passed uneventfully, save for the eerie silence that accompanied him. There was no rustling of animals, no birdsong, just an unbroken stillness. He attributed it to altitude, convincing himself it was his nerves playing tricks. But then came the whispers. They started on the third night, soft, almost melodic, carried by the wind as he lay inside his tent. At first, he assumed it was merely the wind funneling through the crags. But the more he listened, the more he realized the voices were calling his name. By the fourth day, he felt watched. Shadows danced at the edge of his vision, dissolving whenever he turned his head. His compass spun aimlessly, and his GPS device flickered before shutting off completely. He could still see his path, yet something deep within him screamed that he was walking in circles. Then he found the cairns, stacks of stones arranged in patterns too intricate for any natural formation. The first pile he discovered had 5 stones. The second had 4. The third had 3. They were counting down. That night, sleep was impossible. His fire burned low, and the whispers grew closer. His tent walls billowed, though there was no wind. He gripped his knife, his breath hitching when he saw the imprint of a hand pressing against the fabric from outside. He bolted, leaving everything behind. He ran down the mountain trail, lungs burning as the whispers turned into agonized screams. Shadows flitted between the trees, chasing him. He dared not look back. Dawn's light spilled over the horizon as he stumbled into the village. Relief flooded his veins, but it was short-lived. The villagers stared, their faces contorted with horror. One elderly man stepped forward, his trembling fingers tracing symbols into the dirt. "You were never meant to return," the old man murmured. "The mountain does not let go." Confused, he turned to look back at Black Hollow Ridge. That was when he saw it. He wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, a mirage brought on by exhaustion, but deep down he knew better. His doppelgänger stood motionless, eyes devoid of anything human. And then it smiled, a slow, stretching, unnatural grin that split across its too pale face. He stumbled back, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Who are you?" he whispered. The figure cocked its head, and his own voice slithered from its lips. "You should have stayed." Panic surged through him, and he turned to the villagers for answers. But they had already begun retreating into their homes. Doors slammed shut, curtains were drawn. The elderly man who had spoken before merely shook his head, his gaze brimming with sorrow. "The mountain follows," he whispered, before vanishing into the mist. For the next few nights, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the whispers, louder, clearer, filled with hunger. Shadows stretched too long under the moonlight, and sometimes, when he glanced at his reflection in a window, it took just a second too long to mimic his movements. He tried to leave. He packed a bag, forced himself onto the only road out of the village, and walked until his legs burned. But no matter how far he went, he always ended up right back where he started. On the 7th night, he woke to the sound of knocking. Slow, rhythmic, coming from his window. He held his breath, paralyzed with dread, as the knocking continued. Then, a voice. His voice. "Let me in." He no longer knew how much time had passed. The whispers had grown louder, and the shadows no longer fled from the light. His reflection smiled when he didn't. His own voice mocked him from the darkness. The villagers had been right. The mountain did not let go. He was becoming something else. And soon he knew he would be standing at the edge of the trees, waiting for the next traveler to arrive. The wind howled through the pines like a mournful dirge, carrying whispers of forgotten travelers. High in the rugged mountains of Wyoming, A lone trekker named Daniel Pierce set out on a solo expedition, seeking the thrill of isolation. He had heard the stories of the hollow peaks, rumors of hikers who never returned, of strange lights flickering in the mist, of voices calling from the void, but he dismissed them as backwoods folklore. He was here for the challenge, the untouched beauty of the wilderness. Daniel's journey began under a crisp autumn sky. The higher he climbed, the more the world below seemed to disappear, swallowed by the ever-thickening fog. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of unseen creatures darting between the trees. By the second night, the unease began to creep in. The forest seemed to change. The trees gnarled and twisted in ways they hadn't been before. His compass spun erratically, and his GPS flickered and died. With no signal, no clear path, and dwindling daylight, Daniel pressed on, convinced he'd find his bearings at sunrise. Then came the voices, faint at first, like the echo of wind against the cliffs. But as night fell, they grew clearer, whispering his name in hushed, shuddering breaths. Daniel turned back. He spun around, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the blackness, illuminating nothing but trees and fog. His pulse thundered in his ears. He told himself it was the wind, that exhaustion was playing tricks on him, until he saw the footprints. They weren't his, fresh imprints in the damp earth, leading deeper into the woods. Barefoot, human, a cold dread settled into his bones, but he followed, unwilling to believe what his mind screamed at him to flee from. The path narrowed, weaving through dense undergrowth until he reached a clearing, an unnatural break in the forest. A cabin stood there, old and forgotten, its wooden frame sagging like it had been waiting centuries for him to arrive. A single candle burned in the window. Daniel hesitated, the primal part of his brain begging him to run. But curiosity gnawed at him, overpowered reason. He stepped forward, the porch groaning beneath his weight, and pushed the door open. Inside, dust swirled in the flickering light. The walls were lined with photos, black and white images of hikers, explorers, people whose faces were frozen in expressions of fear. His heart seized in his chest as he scanned the images, recognizing a pattern. Each photo bore a name, scrawled in ink beneath it. One of them read, Daniel Pierce. The picture was recent. He was wearing the same jacket, the same gear, but he had never been here before. A sound behind him, a slow, deliberate creak. Daniel turned, his breath catching as he saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was him. The doppelgänger's face was shadowed, but Daniel knew, somehow impossibly, that it wore his own expression of horror. The candle sputtered out. Darkness swallowed everything. Daniel Pierce was never seen again. Hikers who venture too close to the hollow peaks still report strange occurrences. Echoing footsteps in the night, flickering lights in the mist, and whispers that sound like a name that changes depending on who is listening.